thought I would take a moment to chronicle my experience as a Howard Jones fan, starting from about 10 or 11 years old up till now. So here we go. Filtered out. In early 1984, America was introduced to Howard Jones for the first time with the release of his first single, New Song. Let's take a look at my life at that point. I was 11 at the time and in the middle of the 5th grade. We were living in Arlington, Texas. I want to highlight the region of the country we were in, the South. Conservative. It's important to understand that radio stations were not as syndicated back then as they are now. This meant that LA, Miami, Dallas, New York, Cincinnati, etc. all had unique playlists in rotation. The common ground between them was usually the top charters. The common ground was surely influenced by television, magazines, concert promoters, as well as the brand new MTV. In 1984, Dallas-Fort Worth had the following FM stations debuting new music. There were 2 urban stations, KKDA FM 104.5 and KNOK FM 107.5, 2 easy listening adult contemporary stations, KMEZ FM 100.3 and KVIL FM 103.7, 2 country stations, KSCS 96.3 and KPLX 99.5, 1 top 40, KAFM 92.5, 2 rock stations, KZoo 97.9 and KTXQ Q102, and 1 hybrid top 40/rock KEGL 97.1. Howard was fortunate enough at some point to be played on multiple radio formats. I'm not sure if that was the case this early on or not though. For this reason, I will assume a song like New Song would have been categorized as a top 40 song. After all, New Song peaked at 27 on March 31st, 1984 with a total of 15 weeks in the Billboard Top 100 and a total of 6 weeks in the Top 40. What I'm getting at is that I have no recollection of ever listening to it on the radio when it came out. I'll break it down why I don't recall hearing New Song when it first came out the best that I can. DFW had 10 stations of which only 2 would have possibly played New Song. This would mean that Top 40 would have been on the radio 20% of the time, depending on where you were at the time when the radio was on. However, only one of the 2 stations was dedicated to Top 40. KEGL also played rock, so that should knock the number down to about 15% for Top 40. Now, I said before that percentage depending on where you were. At 11 years old, I would have spent the majority of my time in school or at home with my parents or visiting family on the weekends. My cousins would have been listening to rock and Top 40. My parents would have been listening to Top 40 mainly 80% of the time, and country secondarily 20% of the time, and the extended family would have been listening to mainly country. A separate consideration would be who's playing what on each Top 40 radio station. Well, the Top 40 songs most likely, right? So if New Song was in the Top 40 for 6 weeks total, and there are 40 artists to get through before repeating the playlist at an average of 4.5 minutes per song with commercials, the song would have been played once every 3 hours or 8 times a day. Subtract sleep and school from the total hours in a day, that would have left about 2 hours of music playing non-stop wherever I happened to be at the time. That isn't very realistic. It's very likely that I only had 1 to 2 chances of possibly actually hearing the song on the radio during those few hours. If it was in rotation, if the radio was on, if it was on the Top 40 station, if someone didn't change the station, if no one was talking, if we weren't watching TV, if we weren't eating dinner, if we weren't doing homework or chores, and if we weren't outside playing with our friends like most 11-year-old boys do. Background noise. It's possible, but it's very unlikely that I ever actually did listen to it on the radio. I could almost say the same thing for the second single, What Is Love, which was in the Top 40 for 4 weeks and peaked at number 33 on June 9th, 1984. The difference is listening and hearing. I do remember hearing What Is Love. I especially remember the chorus, but with all the obstacles mentioned before, there was little chance that I ever retained the name of the song or the artist, unless the odds were higher. or if there was something that stood out more about the artists themselves. In early 1984, Michael Jackson was dominant. He was everywhere. It was Michael mania, as they say. I was very busy with a friend collecting Michael Jackson clippings and posters, and we were trying to be Michael Jackson with our dance moves and choreography. It was ridiculous. Howard Jones was obscured into the background by all the major acts that were crowding MTV and the airwaves. Like to Get to Know You Well crush. I can still remember precisely sitting in 7th grade history class next to Darla Johnson, who I had a major crush on. She heard me singing a song that I had just heard on the radio, Like to Get to Know You Well. I had no idea who sang it. I just remember the song was the background track to this heartthrob who sat next to me in class. Howard's second album, Dream Into Action, was released in March of 1985 and reached the top 10 in the United States. In fact, it went gold and platinum. At this point, Howard was becoming an arena-sized performer. I didn't know his name yet, but I was well aware of his hits from this album. Howard who? Then, on March 24th, 1986, No One Is to Blame was released with a new treatment produced by Phil Collins and Hugh Padgham. This song was played night and day. It was a fantastic song. Lyrically, it was poetry, brilliantly contrasting. That's probably why it was such an easy song to learn the words to. I had to have this song. For the first time since Queen's Another One Bites the Dust, I actively seeked out the artist's name and the song title. But did they say Howard Johnson or Howard Jones? Either way, I recorded it onto a cassette from the radio, as I did with many other songs I liked. That's what you did as a kid with no budget for music. You recorded your favorites from the radio onto cassette tape back in those days. You had to wait for the song to come on and be very quick to hit record. It wasn't easy. I almost never got the beginning of any song. Either I wasn't fast enough or the DJ would talk over the entire beginning of the song, all the way up to the first lyrics. I hated that. Why don't they shut up? Then they would cut the song off too early near the end as well. I continued this trend when we got a VCR. I would sit for hours waiting for a video to come on so that I could record it. That usually didn't work out because another family member would tape right over my stuff. Revelation, the second album first. Summer came, and with it, time. Time to relax and enjoy being out of school for a few months. I had a small weekly allowance. I was very good at saving up for things that I really wanted. Some motivators for saving my money were a trip to Six Flags, or a trip to a theater, or maybe a new record or tape. My mother and I were at a store. I want to say it was Walmart back then when they actually carried records and tapes. I always enjoyed browsing through records just because of the wild covers and artists. These bands and artists were so different looking than the people I saw every day, especially in Texas. Then the moment that would change my life forever happened. A black album cover with 5 distinctive green silhouettes with a bright orange spiky-haired man sitting in the middle, and then a sort of calligraphy at top saying, Howard Jones. To my excitement, I quickly learned from the back cover that this is the guy who sings No One Is to Blame and Like to Get to Know You Well. I can't tell you how giddy I was at this moment. I would never get home fast enough to listen to this album. The rest of the song titles could have been invisible because I didn't care. I was getting this album. But wait, I didn't have a record player. My brother had a record player, but he had just smashed my vinyl Superman 2 soundtrack because I left it on his turntable. I wasn't going to let that happen again. I looked through the cassette tapes and found the cassette version of the album. I paid for it with my own money, and I remember a certain strange look from my mom when she saw the cover with this rooster-doo haircut on the singer. Next, the christening of a new HoJo fan. There I was in my bedroom in our apartment in Bedford, Texas, ripping off the cellophane wrapper and putting the white with black text cassette tape into my little portable stereo dual cassette player. How I remember that moment so vividly. Side A, Things Can Only Get Better. I was leveled. I had no idea that I already knew this song. No idea that Howard sang it. Life in One Day. Can Lightning Strike Twice? I knew this song. I hadn't even got to the songs that I bought the album for, and I was just dancing around. No One Is to Blame. Wow. What a stark difference from the radio version. I liked it, but I was disappointed not to have the radio version that I had grown accustomed to. Dream Into Action, the title track. This song felt rather metallic and different to what I had already heard, but it was still okay. With the last stabs of the track, I couldn't tell when the song would end. It dropped me right into Like to Get to Know You Well. I think every hair and every goosebump was raised hearing this song in its entirety for the first time. I'm sure I had to rewind it and play it again and again. The rest of the album was new territory and a journey into new sounds and textures and moods. It really had a bit of everything. It was quite imaginative. From the stabbing synths and assault and battery, married with piano, choirs, and string, to the hip-hop-ish bounce right back, to the eerie elegy, to the mechanized automaton, to the haunting hunger for the flesh. It all felt like uncharted territory. Is There a Difference, though, a fun little song, didn't quite take me anywhere, but I still enjoy it. What a ride for my first Howard Jones album and first new album to buy as a 13-year-old. The liner notes. There were a lot of hot days during the summer of 1986. My parents were both at work and my brother had a summer job. I couldn't go too far off site. My dad worked maintenance at the apartment complex, so I could hang out at the clubhouse playing darts, shooting pool, or swimming. The rest of the time, I was either watching cable or in my room learning basic keyboard skills and listening to Dream Into Action repeatedly. This album was ingrained in my brain. I must have drawn the cover hundreds of times and memorized the liner notes. I wanted to know more. Who were all of these people mentioned in the liner notes? More importantly, what was the Howard Jones fan club and how could I become part of it? Video. I spent 2 weeks at my cousin's house just before starting the 7th grade. He had no choice but to listen to Howard Jones the whole time I was there. They had MTV, so we watched a lot of that. We saw the video to Things Can Only Get Better, and I was very excited. I would stay up all night hoping and waiting for the video to come on again. I remember us both writing this elaborate fan letter that we were going to send to Howard personally. We wanted proof that he was going to read it and respond to it personally. I don't know what happened to the letter, but I can assure you we never actually sent it. The 12-inch EP format. We went to the mall one day in the autumn of 1986. There was a brand new Howard Jones album out called 1 to 1. I only had enough money for one purchase. I also saw the US EP of Action Replay for the first time. It was also released in 1986 to an American and Canadian audience. I didn't know any of the material from the new album, but the radio version of No One Is to Blame was on Action Replay, along with some of the mixes that I was familiar with from Dream Into Action, like Look Mama and Bounce Right Back. So the choice was obvious for me, Action Replay on vinyl. My brother would just have to deal with it because I couldn't find the cassette version in the store that day. The important thing about Action Replay is that for the first time I was being exposed in a non-passive way to an element of Howard's first album, Humans Live, in the song Hide and Seek, the long version. On first listen, I was on velvet hearing the fully uninterrupted radio version of No One Is to Blame. This was followed by a new take on Look Mama. It was fun to hear all of the hidden synth parts brought to the forefront of the mix. Now, Hide and Seek was dull and boring and just too long for my 13-year-old ears at that time. My enjoyment of this album was divided by family board game night and junk food. It was a school night and listening to B-side would have to wait till another day. I have no recollection of Always Asking Questions and how I felt listening to it. I simply don't remember. I like the bass chops on Bounce Right Back Cause and Effect mix, but overall I was only averagely impressed, mostly because the song didn't do a lot for me to begin with. Specialty, however, was a real gem. The chorus just took me into outer space, especially at the end. The universe would continue to elude me from the easy access to Howard Jones material, and this would become a trend. My parents added some new cable channels to the package we currently had. Along with that came a little program guide so that you could know what was coming on. I discovered that there was a full airing of the Howard Jones live Last World Dream concert just 2 days before we got the channels. That was very frustrating for me. My parents could clearly see how big of a Howard Jones fan I was becoming, and they gave me 1 to 1 for my 14th birthday in December of 1986. I have fond memories of riding my 10-speed bicycle to school listening to the new Howard Jones 1-to-1 album on cassette with its ultra-sleek transparent shell case. It was extra cool because the sleeve unfolded to reveal the song lyrics. Imports. We moved to Georgia for about a year and discovered all kinds of new record stores and malls, unlike what we had in Texas. The contrast and availability of music genres was staggering. There was way more in Georgia than in Texas. In one of my favorite record stores, Record Bar, I found Howard's first album, Humans Live, which contained at least one song that I was familiar with, Hide and Seek. I also bought the 12-inch album on vinyl because it had two songs I was familiar with, Always Asking Questions and Like to Get to Know You Well, International Mix. Halfway through the mall, I realized again that we had no record player at home. I returned the vinyl and purchased the cassette tape version of the 12-inch album. Listening to Humans Live was a trip. Side A, Conditioning, an odd Thomas Dolby-ish song that ends with an overstuffed closet. What is Love? I was astonished all over again, just like when I was hearing Dream Into Action for the first time. I loved hearing this song again. Pearl in the Shell was fun. I found the album version of Hide and Seek easier to digest. Hunt the Self sounded punk compared to what I'd heard out of Howard so far. I finally heard a new song and it seemed so pop-tartish compared to what I'd just heard at the end of side A. I didn't hear ooh ooh ooh, I heard dee dee dee. Don't Always Look at the Rain and Natural were relaxing, but didn't strike me too hard at the first time around. Equality was a hit for me right out of the bag. I thought I was listening to Aha's Take On Me at first. Humans Live seemed very tribal and sinister, and with the opening lyrics, gave my brothers more ammo to call Howard names and me names for listening to it. A commonly misunderstood lyric and risky, even if not written by Howard himself. The 12-inch album further cemented the Humans Live album in my mind. I really loved the purely synth-driven songs on these two albums. VHS video. While at Blockbuster Video Rental Store, I discovered a live concert VHS tape called Howard Jones' Like to Get to Know You Well. I had to have it. My parents were cool enough to rent it for me. The 12-inch single format and songbooks. While in Georgia, I discovered the 12-inch single. I had never heard of them before. I found 12-inch singles for the new album and You Know I Love You Don't You and All I Want. Because of this, I started calling record stores to find out if they had other 12-inch singles by Howard. I located a 12-inch promo version of You Know I Love You Don't You and a 7-inch of Things Can Only Get Better backed with the new song that I'd never heard before called Wild Look for the Key. This 7-inch was at a record store called Turtles, just walking distance from where I lived. I went down there and looked at it so many times. I hid it in the back of a bunch of other records so that it wouldn't disappear someday, as if somebody else was going to come and look for it. After I saved enough money, I went down there and picked it up. I remember that we didn't even have a record player at the time. I'd have to wait, but at least it was mine. I found songbooks for Action Replay and a generic Howard Jones piano guitar songbook. Risk. Late in the year 1987, I sat down to write a letter to the Howard Jones fan club. I sent my letter off and received a reply that included an orange application form, a biography, and a stage schematic for the gear used for the 1-to-1 tour, and a merchandise list. I memorized this stuff at the time. It was a bummer reading the merchandise list, as most of the stuff was already sold out. I sent off for my membership anyway. Well, I did something wrong because nothing came back, and my mom was convinced that those types of things were scams and someone probably just kept my money. I didn't let that deter me for too long though. Later in the winter, I sent off for a membership to the fan club again. The membership packet arrived at home while I was away on a trip. I called home to tell my parents about my trip and how everything was going, and my mom said, "You have a letter here from Howard Jones." I couldn't wait to get home. So in January 1989, I finally became a member of RISC, the Howard Jones fan club, number 11039. The packet included stickers, biography, photos of Howard and Jed Hoyle, who used to mime for Howard's songs on stage in the early days. It also included a 7-inch record with 2 live tracks, Things Can Only Get Better and Pearl in the Shell, if I remember correctly. Additionally, the member packet came with a couple of fan club magazines, Risk 12 and Risk 13, that covered what Howard was working on recently. The magazine was pretty cool because for the first time I knew exactly what was going on up to the minute. Finally, the pack included a handwritten letter from Howard's parents, John and Thelma Jones, telling me up to the minute what Howard was doing and where he's touring. Cross That Line came out, and along with it, a ton of merchandise. When school started in the fall, I took a part-time job at the local pharmacy grocery store as a clerk. All of my money went into my Howard Jones collection. I was 16, and for the first time, I could get into my car and drive on my own. I no longer had to bug my mom to drive me across town to some small record store. I started driving all over the Metroplex, collecting up Howard's back catalog, of which was mostly overpriced and secondhand stuff. I spent hours looking through archives, boxes, bins, posters, records, tapes, buttons, magazines, etc. I also bought a second-hand CD player from a friend of my parents, and it was a pretty big deal at the time. My parents bought me Dream of Action and Humans Lib on CD that same day. In addition to the record shops, I was ordering everything available from the fan club. Thelma was always throwing in extra thing here and there and continuing her handwritten letters. Letter writing to Thelma was becoming routine and a relationship was growing. I would send her tapes of me singing and playing my own renditions of Howard's music, and she always encouraged me. I had 1 hour each day with nothing to do in school. It was sort of a study hall or sleep hour. I decided one day to write 50 letters to the fan club and send them all at the same time. It took 2 weeks. Each letter required 2 stamps for postage, and I also included 2 stamps in the letter so they could mail me back, which I later found out they can't even do that with our stamps. Either way, that was about a $50 endeavor. I still have 2 of the replies from Thelma's letters asking me to never do this, as it was wasteful and very taxing on their time. And she also sent me back the unused stamps. Toward the end of the traditional fan club days, a summer 1991 Howard Jones convention was announced. I was graduating high school and we didn't have money for something like that. However, Thelma sent me a graduation gift of an access pass to the convention as a souvenir. I ordered a VHS of the event later on. First concert and meeting Howard. In 1992, Howard came to Dallas during the acoustic tour promoting his In the Running album. This was my first Howard Jones live experience. It was in a small venue that held about 300 people. It was just Howard on piano and percussionist Carol Steele. We were in the front row. I was mesmerized the whole time. My friends who were forced to listen to Howard Jones with me growing up came along, and they were equally amazed. This is also where I met Howard's longtime manager, David Stopps, for the first time. David showed us around to the back after the show, and we got to meet Howard. I must have been 10 inches off the ground that evening. I'd finally met my hero. Seeing how well he played his music acoustically made me realize how much sheer dedication and determination is required to be at the top. Meeting Thelma and John. Howard came through Dallas the next year on the Synthesizer Tour to promote his first CD independent from Warner Electric Atlantic called Working in the Back Room. This tour was different because Howard brought his parents Thelma and John on the road with him. My brother, who once couldn't stand Howard Jones, likely because I played it all the day long, came to the show with me. When I met Thelma and John, I was floored that they actually remembered who I was. I felt like I was seeing my grandparents I hadn't seen in a while. It was very natural. Pen pals and international calls. It was very late in the game, but since I was living on my own in the mid-1990s, I started reaching out to fans from the old fan club magazines. Most of them had moved on. However, one guy stood out from the rest of them, and that was Andrew Barsby. Andy ran the Howard Jones Worldwide Record Finding Service. The idea was that he would swap lists with you, and you would help each other find items that were in your area that the other couldn't find in their own. We swapped letters a few times, and he actually sent me a few cassette tapes with some rare items. I eventually learned how to make international calls. I would talk to Andy on the phone for 30 minutes at a time because that's all I could afford. I was even calling Thelma and John periodically. I would never do that now. I guess at that age, I hadn't learned enough about protocol. I called once and Howard's dad told me I just missed Howard. He just left a few minutes before. This is Howard Jones and welcome to the Howard Jones Information Network, was the message on the original website that took about 1,000 years to load. I didn't have a computer, but I worked with a guy who had access to the World Wide Web at his house. He even said I could come over and try it out. How does it work? What am I going to do with it? Hey, I'll go to the Howard Jones website. Sure. It was www.amug.org/tilde-HoJo info. God, that was a mouthful. But I could go see that, so I did. Tim Davis had a tiled music note background and an uncompressed Windows.wav file with the announcement by Howard that seriously took about 45 minutes to load. Because of the first experience, it was useless to me. At some point, a Howard Jones discussion group had been started, but I learned about it later on. David stops in the fan tribute CD. I became a member of the discussion group called HoJo Talk, and we came up with the idea of doing a fan-made CD of Howard's songs as a tribute. My brother managed that project from start to finish. Fans were sending their submissions to us, and we got permission from David to do it in limited quantities. I submitted a medley where others stuck to the single song format. Some of the submissions were really first class. Others were karaoke versions with Howard's album played in the background. Just horrible. We drove down to San Antonio, Texas for an 80s festival that Howard was playing at. David took us backstage to Howard's dressing room where we had Howard autograph a copy for a giveaway, and I had a special CD I made just for Howard. Glenn Kelly and HoJo Talk. Let the people have their say. When I finally got a computer for myself and got plugged into online world, I suddenly found myself either busy writing my own material or wasting my time on the internet aside from a 65-hour-a-week job. Glenn Kelly had taken on HoJo Talk and Let the People Have Their Say project. To me, this was the second generation of fans, even though it included many of the diehard first ones. HoJo 20th anniversary concert and the fan meet and greet. When the Howard Jones 20th anniversary concert was announced, I knew I had to get there. 3 reasons. Howard Jones, I always wanted to see England, and I wanted to meet the fans. Again, I saved all my money, teamed up with some folks, and we made it happen. I've remained friends with many of these people ever since. High speed, high bandwidth. I find it fortunate to be a fan of someone who really values his fans. He never stops. Howard is as active as ever. The sheer amount of coverage and availability to him is overwhelming. I used to seek out everything I could. It's all there when you want it nowadays. I've even stopped collecting and archiving because of the abundance. My parents even got to finally meet Howard. He seems to be just about everywhere. Midlife fandom. As a midlife fan, one finds that the time and energy spent working, raising a family, and all the chores that go with that, keeping up with the Joneses, is more passive. I simply must pick and choose how I want to engage because of the limited resources. There have been shows nearly in my backyard and I've missed them because my head was elsewhere. Social media plays such a big part in our lives. I find myself in and out of contact with so many people in the Howard Jones universe. Fans, behind the scenes people, band members, and yes, even the man himself from time to time. It's been quite a journey.